social change in China, why you think of what's going on in the United States as one clearly affected by the energy revolution and the mix of domestic factors that are at play there too. So as I think about this going forward with these 4 questions, what I'd like to do first, though, is start with a little anecdote, which I think captures how this world is coming about. Last summer, I sat at lunch in London with the ambassador, the Russian ambassador to Britain. He and I had gotten to know each other a little bit socially through various meetings, and actually initially in a discussion over Syria, where we had, I think it's fair to say, fairly opposing views about what was going on in the country and what Russia's role could be. But he's an exceptionally skilled and seasoned diplomat, and as we got to know each other, we ended up seeing each other regularly and still do. So last summer, as we were sitting there discussing the state of the world, again, this is 9 months ago, we got to the question of the technology industry and how some countries have obviously, your chairman was talking about Silicon Valley earlier, have really gone way miles ahead of others, and what it takes to create a successful innovation culture in an economy. And he said to me, interestingly, he said, look, the reality is that for us in Russia, we will never be able to have the kind of innovative, dynamic technology industry that you see in America. And I said, why not? And he said, well, because for us, we must control at the state level our technology industry. Why? He said. I asked him, and he said, because we have to be ready for the day when we get sanctioned by the West. Now, this is 9 months ago, where certainly I couldn't imagine, and I don't think he was imagining either, that Putin was going to go in and absorb and annex the Crimea, and we're going to be in the crisis we're in now. So I tell this story because it gives you a sense of how great powers, in a way that really is quite dramatically different from the last 20 years since the end of the Cold War, are now thinking of their interests, of their economic management, and certainly of their political and security management in increasingly diverging terms. This is a critical, critical point. And as I go into the first question, what kind of globalization? I would point you to what's come more recently as a function of what's happened here in the Russia crisis. And that is that as you see the West actually start to impose the kinds of sanctions that he was fearing 9 months ago, whether it's on the banking system or whether it's on technology or whether it's on payment systems and energy markets, what is happening is underneath the surface of what still looks like a very integrated global economy, not just the Russians, but certainly the Chinese as well, are exploring ways to create, and we can have a discussion about whether this is an illusion and how realistic this is, but they are certainly doing this, exploring ways to create a separate internet, separate payment processing systems so they're not vulnerable to being sanctioned out of Visa or MasterCard or SWIFT, and even separate energy markets, where they can trade their energy outside the global marketplace at discounts to select partners to either strengthen their currency or in other ways protect their market share. This is a phenomenon that I think has a fairly significant consequence for us. And so when I look at what kind of globalization we're going to see, I would put it to you in this way. We saw really the first stage of globalization. Globalization 1.0 was what you would think of as the British Empire and what that created. Globalization 2.0, the United States and what it created after the Second World War through the global institutions and through driving a global free market, very much obviously with the design of aiding the United States and its allies, but clearly creating a set of rules globally that have benefited the vast majority of human beings. Globalization 3.0, that I think we are in the process of entering now, is one that looks very different from the first two. And it is by definition one that is a story of fragmentation and divergence. It's a map of the world that doesn't look flat or converging into one model, but much more like an archipelago, a series of islands of power, of economic interests, of value systems, of human rights standards, of models of governance, both politically and economically. And this is a globalization which clearly is defined by a broader and more messy decision-making table, where existing alongside one model of globalization, economic management, what you might have here, Europe and the United States, will be forms of economic management that look like Brazil, much stronger role for the state, much bigger commitment to social equity, that might look like China, which is balancing, of course, a strong political control with an enormous economic and social challenge, met over the last 40 years, I would put to you, with phenomenal success relative to where we could have been. The Russian model, which clearly has enormous weaknesses, but is driven by different motives. And so this is a story of globalization that will look much more like a fragmenting, contending set of ideas where trade as a basic matter will no longer be negotiated under one agreement, but much more through bilateral and regional arrangements. You see the Americans have essentially made this decision, and therefore with their Asia and America's trade agreements are trying to carve out different areas. And what this means clearly is a globalization that has three key risks to it. The risks are populism, nationalism, and protectionism. Now, it's not that the last form of globalization didn't have these risks, but inbuilt to a much greater degree in this contested form of globalization with powers much more equal, much more able to summon their economic strength to advance different political ends, is one where these three risks will be there. We're going to see it in the European elections this week, the power of populism, and we see it obviously elsewhere around the world. So as you think about what form of globalization, I think as business leaders and others, the first point I would put to you therefore is this is not the globalization that we grew up with, so to speak, professionally. It's not a globalization that seemed like a long and winding road towards a global convergence to one model, that is the model of the West, the model of the United States, and one that puts much more of a premium on our ability to think in the shoes of a business leader or a government leader in India or Vietnam